Formula One last minute introduced a brand new sprint race weekend format for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. But the most excitement during this weekend that we saw was George inspecting Max's side pod, we had De Vries saving some engine mileage, and then the FIA set up a obstacle course for Esteban Ocon, so that wasn't particularly exciting. But was this whole thing as bad as it seemed, or was there something else going on here? And before we get into it, this week's video is brought to you by Headout, but more on them in a minute. Now, there's so many things going on with this new sprint format, so let me give you my point of view as a fan, but also as a former engineer, and hopefully we can make a little bit more sense of it. Now, to figure out how we got here, we need to ask this question: what's the point of the sprint weekend? The bottom line is that Formula One just wanted to add some more excitement, which I completely understand. Excitement's good, you can sell more tickets, you can have happier fans, everybody wins, right? And the sprint tries to do that. There's a decisive session every day. But how much action do we really need? At some point, is this too much and can it water down the whole weekend experience? Or is there another problem? And let's talk about it, starting with the differences between this new format. So what's different? Previously, the sprint weekend format looked like this. You had free practice 1 on Friday, then you would go into Parc Fermé and go straight into qualifying. Then on Saturday morning, you'd have FP2 followed by the sprint race. That sprint race then sets the order for the Grand Prix on Sunday. So what's the problem with this format? For me, the biggest thing was predictability. Everything that happened on Saturday just unshuffled the grid and you had a more predictable Grand Prix. It's like having a short stint, red flag, restart, and go again into another race. It removed all the chaos that qualifying can sometimes introduce. The new format actually makes a few improvements to this, and here's a couple of things that I think the new format does a lot better. Number one, there's only one practice session, and I think this is actually great. Realistically, drivers don't need all 3 practice sessions, and several drivers have been quoted as even saying that. Less practice accentuates the skill gap. The drivers that are more attacking more early with more confidence will tend to do better. And it puts emphasis on nailing the setups, and I'm looking at you, race engineers. And there's less data gathering for teams. Race engineers don't have a whole lot of tire data. They don't understand how the tires are going to behave at high fuel, and that should add more unpredictability for the sprint and for the Grand Prix. Now, it does remove a weekend for development, which is okay because we've got 23 races and only 6 of them are sprints. I think the teams are coping with this just fine. Now, the second thing that I think is a massive improvement is the new format has a separate qualifying session for the Grand Prix and for the sprint race. And I'd much rather see another qualifying session than another free practice session that's in Parc Fermé, wouldn't you? It looks good on paper, but this weekend identified there's a couple of things that we need to fix before this is the best version of that format. Now, the first thing that we need to fix from this new format is the tire allocation. The tire rules for the sprint weekend format are now pretty simple. You get 12 sets of tires, you give back 1 set after FP1, and 1 set with the highest mileage after the sprint race. Pretty much the only rule that we have now is you have to use a new medium tire for sprint qualifying 1, sprint qualifying 2, and then you have to use a new soft for sprint qualifying 3. Then in the sprint and the race, you use whatever tires you have left. But this weekend, Lando Norris showed us a very clear problem with this new rule. On Friday, Lando used all of his new soft tires, and then we get to Saturday in sprint qualifying. He makes it through to sprint qualifying 3, and he doesn't have any new soft tires, so guess what? He sits in the garage. And this goes to show you that teams are focusing on the main qualifying event. They don't care so much about the sprint qualifying, especially if you're in the midfield. It makes no sense. But we want to see the drivers on track. We get another qualifying session, and your person who's likely to qualify in the bottom of Q3 is sitting in the garage because he doesn't have any new tires. That needs to go. Now, the second thing that we've kind of highlighted is there's no incentive for the slower teams on Saturday in the sprints. There's a massive imbalance in the risk reward there. Points are only rewarded to the top 8. I mean, we've got a third race distance with no pit stops. Nothing really is going to happen for these guys. And some teams just treated this session this weekend as let's see if the soft tire is any good. Spoiler alert, it was terrible. But on the other hand, these teams are unlikely to score any points on Sunday anyway, and I kind of think that the points should be awarded on merit, not on a participation, so we'll have to think about that one. Now, the third point is a little bit more nuanced, and I heard a lot of people talking about this. They said there was no build-up or flow to the weekend, and at first I was like, I disagree, but looking back on the weekend, I feel like that is actually a bit of a problem. I mean, think about it. Friday's qualifying sets the order for Sunday, then you have 2 separate events on Saturday, and it just feels disjointed and almost overloading. Now, as a fan, I prefer qualifying sessions over practices, but there did feel like there was something missing in terms of the way the weekend felt. But before we talk about that, why don't we talk about some easy fixes that F1 can implement to make this new sprint format even better? Before we get to that, I want to tell you about Headout. They're now offering tickets to all the Formula One races. And if you're struggling to find tickets to a race coming up, you should definitely check them out. The prices are among the best and the seating and availability is fantastic. Whether you're looking for tickets for a Grand Prix at the end of the season or one coming up next weekend, they have you covered. And if you're looking for something very soon, I've got you. We have the Miami Grand Prix coming up this weekend on the 5th to 7th of May, and then 2 weeks after that is the Imola Grand Prix. You can use code BREAK30 to get 30% off of these tickets. Or you can use code BREAK to get 10% off of any of the other races. Thanks to Shoutout for sponsoring this video, and now back to how we're going to fix the sprint race weekend format. Now, the first thing that we can fix with the sprint is the tire allocation. Now, the whole thing of a team having to sit out if they don't have a new soft for sprint qualifying 3, that's an easy fix. Just force the teams to keep a new soft aside for the sprint qualifying session in case they make it to Q3. If they don't, you have a new soft for either the sprint or the race. Or you could just let the drivers run a used soft in SQ3. There's no problem really setting a lap on a used tire. It'll be a little bit slower, but it's better than them sitting in the garage. My proposal is to reserve a new tire for SQ3. Now, here are some ideas for the second thing, which is a lack of incentive for the slower teams on Saturday in the sprint qualifying and the sprint race. And the lack of incentive for a slower car is kind of a difficult problem because then it turns into some kind of points charity, right? One proposal is a reverse grid, but I don't think this makes much sense for a short sprint race, as you'll have midfield teams finishing in the top because it's just not enough time for the faster cars to get through to be back in pace order. Or you could do what F2 does and reverse the top 10 only, but then I think you'll have the 4th and 5th teams consistently winning those, and that doesn't really make any sense either. I really don't know how to fix the incentive for the midfield teams right now. I think points should be awarded on merit, and I think reverse grid in a non-spec series is just kind of gimmicky, so we'll come back to it. Now, I don't know if the lack of buildup was really a problem, but I want to know what you guys think about this one, because that's one of the more nuanced problems of this format. So one of the suggestions I've heard for this, which is interesting, I'm just not sure how I feel about it, is practice Friday, qualify for the sprint on Friday, then Saturday morning you do the sprint race, and then Saturday night you qualify for the Grand Prix, and then Sunday is the Grand Prix. That just seems weird, and if you have a huge shunt in the race, you're going to miss out on qualifying for the main event, and it just seems weird, but maybe the flow would be better. But even if you make all these changes and you have the perfect sprint race weekend, I don't see the 2023 Azerbaijan Grand Prix going any differently. A lot of people don't like the sprint format, but personally, I think it's alright. But this weekend's sprint race didn't deliver, and the Grand Prix surely didn't deliver either. So here's a few things that I think we can take away from this weekend, and I think they more reflect on Formula 1 as a whole rather than the sprint race format. Baku didn't do the well done Baku thing because of a couple reasons. The chaos from the Baku Grand Prix that we know tends to come from safety cars and race restarts. Don't forget that this is a street circuit and it's not particularly straightforward to overtake here. Baku's typically a 1 or 2 stop race, and often the 2 stop race comes in because of a safety car. Unfortunately, this weekend's safety car came out around the first pit stop window, so it really didn't have too much impact on the order of the race. The other big issue, there were only about 12 overtakes during this race, and this sounds absolutely terrible, but let's put that in context. Last year in Singapore, we had 16 overtakes, and in Monaco, we had 13 overtakes, and neither of those races were terrible. And before you say it, I don't think the problem is street circuits either. I think the main problem that we had with Baku was the same problem we had in Australia. Every single car on the grid could just about do a full race distance on a single hard tire. And in Baku, we had the softest range of tires available for the race. But it's also quite tough to balance because the soft tire was completely useless, and then the hard can do the entire race distance. But I do think there's something there in terms of the range of the tires that we're bringing to races and the tire rules around the race. And the next thing to talk about, which everybody's been going on about, is the DRS. The main DRS zone in Baku was shortened this weekend to make overtaking a little bit more difficult, but the biggest problem was most cars couldn't even get within 1 second to have access to that DRS. People keep saying to remove DRS because it's a gimmick, and I completely agree it is gimmicky, but I will argue that we absolutely need it right now. At the end of last season, I did a study with F1 data analytics, and pretty much it concluded that numerically, 2022 regulations worked in every way. The cars could follow more closely, there were more overtakes than before, so the regulations appear to be working in terms of letting cars follow and overtake. And it seems like after Baku, cars did struggle to follow a little bit more, but it's a relatively low-speed street circuit. I'm not really seeing that being the problem here. In my opinion, we can't make a conclusion about the new sprint race weekend format. I think if the FIA takes some of the suggestions that we've mentioned in this video and implement them for the next sprint, I think that weekend will be a lot better. But I think that brings us nicely on to the question of what's actually wrong with Formula 1. What are we trying to fix? I think the 2022 regulations were great, but we've got a lot of other problems. The sprint race weekend format is not going to fix these cars. They're big, they're heavy, they produce a lot of downforce and drag, which means a lot of dirty air, even with the new regulations. And then meanwhile, we're increasing the number of street circuits with these huge cars. And I think that's more the problem that we need to discuss, but that's for another day. In general, I would say this new format is better than the old one, but the sprint is not the answer to the problem. But I've left a couple more analytical videos here for you to check out, and I'll see you guys soon.